The Poltergeist in the Suburban Home, Parts 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Part 1.
The first time it happened, it was so subtle I nearly dismissed it. It was a Tuesday evening, and my wife, Laura, and I were relaxing in the living room, unwinding after a long day at work. Our two children, Lily and Max, were upstairs, likely engrossed in their respective video games. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the old wood floors. Laura was reading a book, and I was flicking through the channels, struggling to find something worth watching. It was then that I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the kitchen. I muted the TV and listened. The sound continued, rhythmic and persistent, like the soft scrape of nails against wood. "Did you hear that?" I asked Laura, my voice low, not wanting to startle her. She looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "That scratching noise," I said, nodding towards the kitchen. She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't hear anything." I got up and walked into the kitchen, half expecting to find one of the kids playing a prank or perhaps a small animal that had somehow gotten inside. But the kitchen was empty, and the scratching had stopped. I shrugged it off and went back to the living room, thinking it was just my imagination. The next few days passed without incident, and I had all but forgotten about the strange noise. But then on Friday night, something else happened. We were all sitting down to dinner when the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the old house to have electrical issues, especially during storms, but the sky outside was clear. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. "Great," I muttered, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. Laura sighed. "I'll get some candles." As we moved around the house, gathering candles and trying to figure out what was wrong, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was an eerie sensation, like eyes were boring into my back, following my every move. I chalked it up to nerves and focused on getting the power back on. By the time I found the breaker box in the basement, the lights had come back on by themselves. Relieved, I went back upstairs, but the unease lingered. That night, as we settled into bed, Laura turned to me, her eyes wide with concern. "Do you think the house is haunted?" she asked, half joking, but I could see the genuine worry in her eyes. I laughed it off. "Of course not, it's just an old house. Old houses have quirks." But deep down I wasn't so sure. Something felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the cusp of something far more sinister. The real trouble began the following week. Lily came to us one morning, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She said that her toys had moved during the night. At first, we thought she was just having nightmares. But then Max reported similar incidents, objects in his room shifting positions while he slept. Laura and I were perplexed and a bit frightened, but we tried to reassure the kids. "It's probably just the house settling," I said. Though even to my ears, the explanation sounded weak. Then one night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from the kids' rooms towards our bedroom. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. No one was there. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, now echoing throughout the house. Laura woke up and joined me at the door. "What's going on?" she whispered. "I don't know," I replied, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just old house noises or the kids' imagination. Something was in our home, and it was getting bolder. We stood there listening to the eerie sound of unseen footsteps, both of us too afraid to move. The air felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. In that moment, I knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Something that wouldn't be so easily dismissed. This was only the beginning. Chate, Part 2. The disturbances escalated quickly after that night. It started with minor annoyances. Doors creaking open by themselves, lights flickering more frequently, and a cold draft that seemed to follow us from room to room. But as the days passed, these incidents grew more unsettling. One evening, as Laura and I were preparing dinner, we heard a loud crash from the living room. We rushed in to find our family photo, which had hung securely on the wall for years, shattered on the floor. Glass shards were scattered everywhere, and the picture lay face down amidst the debris. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and saw that the glass had been broken from the inside out, as if something had pushed against it with great force. Lily and Max were visibly shaken, their eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's happening?" Max asked, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I could only reassure them that everything would be all right, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. That night, I decided to set up a camera in the living room, hoping to catch whatever was causing these disturbances. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I needed to see something tangible, something I could understand. The next morning I reviewed the footage. At first everything seemed normal. Then around 2 a.m., a strange mist appeared in the frame. It moved slowly, almost deliberately across the room before dissipating near the shattered photo's location. My heart raced as I watched, a cold sweat forming on my brow. This wasn't something I could explain away. I showed the footage to Laura, who looked equally disturbed. "We need to do something," she said. We can't let this go on. We decided to call a local paranormal investigator, someone with experience in dealing with these kinds of phenomena. When I explained the situation over the phone, he sounded intrigued and agreed to come over that evening. His name was Mark, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and an air of quiet confidence. He arrived with a few pieces of equipment, a digital recorder, an EMF meter, and a thermal camera. After a brief introduction, he began his investigation. As Mark walked through the house, the EMF meter spiked several times, especially in the hallway where we had heard the footsteps. He recorded several EVP sessions, asking questions into the air and playing back the recordings to see if any responses were captured. At first, there was nothing, just static and silence. Then in the living room, Mark asked, "Is there anyone here who wants to communicate with us?" There was a pause, and then a faint, almost whispering voice replied, "Leave." My blood ran cold. Laura grabbed my hand, her grip tight. Mark remained calm, nodding as if he had expected this. He played back the recording for us, and we heard the voice again, clearer this time. "Leave." "There's definitely something here," Mark said, his voice steady. "And it's not happy." He suggested a cleansing ritual, something to help rid the house of the negative energy. We agreed, desperate for any solution that might bring us peace. That night, as Mark performed the cleansing, we gathered in the living room, holding hands and hoping for the best. The air felt thick and charged, the oppressive presence even stronger. Mark chanted softly, moving through the house with sage and a small bell. For a moment it seemed to work. The air lightened and the house felt calmer. But then, just as we were starting to relax, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by a series of violent crashes. The lights flickered wildly, and a chilling wind swept through the room. We watched in horror as furniture was tossed around, unseen forces wreaking havoc. Mark's calm facade cracked, and he shouted over the chaos, "We need to get out of here!" We fled the house, the sounds of destruction following us into the night. Standing outside, trembling and frightened, we realized this was far from over. The poltergeist was angry, and it wasn't going to let us go so easily. And so, our ordeal continued, each night bringing new terrors and unanswered questions. We were trapped in our own home, battling an unseen enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Shared Chase, Part 3. Desperation drove us to seek further help. Mark had given us the name of a renowned medium, Sarah, who had dealt with particularly malevolent spirits before. We called her, explaining our situation in hushed, frantic whispers. She agreed to visit us the next day. Sarah arrived in the afternoon, a petite woman with an air of serene confidence that immediately put us somewhat at ease. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos we had been living through. She carried a small bag of tools, crystals, herbs, and various other items I didn't recognize. As soon as she stepped inside, her expression turned grave. "This is a strong presence," she said quietly. "It's been here a long time and is deeply rooted in this place." We gathered in the living room, Sarah at the center, as she began her work. She sprinkled salt in a circle around us and lit a bundle of sage, the pungent smoke filling the air. She closed her eyes and began to chant softly, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. The room grew colder, and a heavy, oppressive feeling settled over us. The temperature dropped so rapidly that we could see our breath. The lights dimmed and flickered, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker and more defined. Then, the whispering started. At first it was faint, barely audible over Sarah's chanting. But it grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of angry voices overlapping and echoing through the room. Sarah's chanting grew louder, more forceful, as she attempted to drown out the voices. Suddenly a deafening crash shook the house and the chanting stopped. The air was electric, charged with an unseen energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah opened her eyes, and they were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We're not dealing with a single spirit," she said, her voice trembling. "There are many, and they are angry." Lily and Max huddled close to us, their faces pale with terror. Laura held them tightly, her eyes wide with fear. I felt utterly helpless, unable to protect my family from this invisible threat. Sarah stood up, her expression resolute. "We need to cleanse the entire house, every room, every corner. It's the only way to drive them out." We spent the next several hours following Sarah's instructions, moving through the house room by room. She used sage, salt, and holy water, chanting and praying, her voice steady and unwavering. The oppressive feeling ebbed and flowed, growing stronger in some areas and weaker in others. In the basement, the air was so thick and heavy that it was difficult to breathe. Sarah paused at the foot of the stairs, her face pale. "This is where they are strongest," she said. "We need to be very careful." As we descended into the darkness, the temperature plummeted further. The shadows seemed to move and shift, forming grotesque shapes that danced at the edges of our vision. Sarah began to chant again, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind blew through the basement, extinguishing the sage. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, filling the room with an almost tangible sense of rage. Objects began to move, clattering and crashing around us. Sarah continued to chant, her voice rising above the chaos. She sprinkled salt and holy water, her movements quick and precise. The air grew colder still, and the voices reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of anger and despair. Just when it seemed unbearable, the wind stopped. The temperature began to rise, and the voices faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Sarah collapsed to her knees, exhausted but triumphant. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
They're gone.
We helped her upstairs, relief washing over us. The house felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. We thanked Sarah profusely, and she gave us instructions to keep the house cleansed and protected. That night, for the first time in weeks, we slept peacefully. The oppressive presence was gone, and the house was quiet. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The poltergeist had been driven out, but I feared it might return, stronger and angrier than before. As I drifted off to sleep, I prayed that our ordeal was truly over. But in the back of my mind, a nagging doubt remained, a whisper of unease that I couldn't ignore. Part 4. Several weeks passed, and life began to return to normal. The kids were laughing again, playing in the yard, and Laura and I found ourselves relaxing without the constant fear that had gripped us. It was a welcome change, a reprieve from the terror that had consumed our lives. But then, on a cold winter's night, it all came rushing back. It started with the lights flickering again, just like before. I was in the living room, reading a book, when the lights dimmed and then went out completely. My heart sank, a familiar dread settling in my stomach. I called out to Laura, who was in the kitchen. "Laura, did the power go out?" She appeared in the doorway, a worried look on her face. "I don't know, let me check the breaker." As she headed to the basement, I felt the temperature drop, the air growing cold and heavy. The same oppressive feeling I thought we had banished filled the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could see my breath in the frigid air. Laura came back upstairs, her face pale. "The breaker is fine. This isn't a power issue." The lights flickered back on, and we both jumped at the sudden brightness. Lily and Max came rushing down the stairs, their faces etched with fear. "Dad, it's happening again," Lily said, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed through the house. We turned to see a chair toppled over in the dining room, the same chair that had been securely tucked under the table moments before. The oppressive presence was back, and it was stronger than ever. "Get the kids," I said to Laura. "We need to get out of here." We hurried to gather our coats and shoes, the air around us growing colder with each passing second. As we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the house. We were trapped. Suddenly a voice echoed through the house, a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "You cannot leave." We huddled together in the hallway, fear gripping us. The lights flickered wildly and objects began to move around us, a whirlwind of chaos. In the midst of the pandemonium, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a shadowy form, indistinct but undeniably menacing. It started to descend, each step echoing like a drumbeat. In that moment of utter despair, a thought flashed through my mind. Sarah's instructions. We had to use the tools she left us. I grabbed the bag of crystals and herbs from the drawer where we had stored them, and Laura and I quickly began to set up a protective circle, just as Sarah had shown us. We lit the sage and began to chant, our voices shaky but determined. The oppressive presence seemed to hesitate, the figure on the stairs pausing in its descent. The cold air grew thicker, the whispers louder, but we kept chanting, holding tightly to the belief that this would work. The shadowy figure let out a roar of anger, and the room shook violently. But then, as we continued our chants, the air began to lighten. The figure wavered, its form becoming less distinct. The temperature started to rise, and the whispers faded. Finally, with one last echoing scream, the shadowy figure dissolved into nothingness. The light stabilized, and the oppressive feeling lifted entirely. The house was still, the air warm and calm. We stood there, panting and exhausted, but victorious. The poltergeist was gone, and this time we felt a finality to it. The house was ours again. We spent the rest of the night reinforcing the protective measures, making sure every corner of the house was cleansed and safeguarded. When we finally crawled into bed, we were exhausted but hopeful. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a profound sense of peace. The ordeal had brought us closer together, and we had emerged stronger for it. The poltergeist had been a formidable foe, but we had prevailed. And this time I knew it was over for good. Our home was finally a place of safety and warmth once more.